The Midnight Train. Part 1. The Rumor. Emily lived in a small town in England. It was a long time ago, in the time of Queen Victoria. Emily was 10 years old. She lived with her family in a little house near the train station. One day, Emily heard something interesting. She was at the market with her mother. Two old ladies were talking. Emily listened to them. "Did you hear about the midnight train?" one lady said. "Oh, yes, I did," the other lady said. "They say it only comes at midnight. How strange." Emily was very curious. She wanted to know more about this train. When she got home, she asked her older brother, Thomas. "Thomas, do you know about the midnight train?" Emily said. Thomas looked at Emily. He was 13 years old and thought he knew everything. "There's no midnight train, Emily. Trains don't run at night. Go play with your dolls." But Emily didn't believe Thomas. She wanted to find out the truth. That night, she couldn't sleep. She thought about the midnight train. What did it look like? Where did it go? Who was on it? The next day, Emily asked her neighbor, Mrs. Baker, about the train. Mrs. Baker was very old and very kind. She always gave Emily and Thomas cookies. "Mrs. Baker, is there really a midnight train?" Emily asked. Mrs. Baker smiled. "Oh, Emily, some things are best left as mysteries. But I will tell you this. Sometimes, late at night, I hear a whistle. It sounds like a train, but it's not like any train I know." Now Emily was even more curious. She had to see this train for herself. Part 2. The Plan. For the next few days, Emily thought about the midnight train. She wanted to see it, but she knew her parents wouldn't let her stay up so late. She needed a plan. One evening, Emily talked to Thomas again. "Thomas, please help me see the midnight train," she said. Thomas sighed. "Emily, I told you, there's no midnight train." But Mrs. Baker heard it. Emily said, "Please, Thomas, I need your help." Thomas looked at his little sister. He saw how much this meant to her. "Okay, Emily," he said, "we can try to see it, but only one time, and then you have to forget about it. Deal?" Emily was so happy. "Deal," she said. She hugged Thomas tightly. The next day, Emily and Thomas made their plan. They would pretend to go to bed early. Then, when their parents were asleep, they would sneak out to the train station. They would wait and see if the midnight train was real. That night, Emily could hardly sleep. She was so excited. At 11:30, she heard a soft knock on her door. It was Thomas. "Are you ready?" he whispered. Emily nodded. She put on her coat and shoes very quietly. Thomas and Emily tiptoed down the stairs. They were careful not to make any noise. They didn't want to wake their parents. They opened the front door slowly. It made a little squeak, but their parents didn't wake up. Emily and Thomas stepped outside into the cool night air. Part 3. The Midnight Train. Emily and Thomas walked to the train station. It was very dark. The moon was big and bright in the sky. Emily held Thomas's hand tightly. When they got to the train station, it was empty. There were no people there. The station looked different at night. It was a little scary. Thomas looked at his watch. "It's 11:55, he said. "If there really is a midnight train, it should come soon." Emily and Thomas sat on a bench. They waited and watched. Everything was very quiet. Suddenly, they heard a sound. It was far away, but getting closer. It sounded like a train whistle. Emily stood up. "Do you hear that, Thomas?" she said. "It's the train." Thomas stood up too. He couldn't believe it. "Maybe it's just a regular train," he said. But it wasn't a regular train. As the sound got closer, Emily and Thomas saw something amazing. A big, black train was coming down the tracks. But this train was different. It seemed to glow with a soft, silver light. The train slowed down and stopped at the station. Emily and Thomas couldn't believe their eyes. The midnight train was real. The door of the train opened. A tall man stepped out. He wore a black uniform and a hat. He looked at Emily and Thomas with kind eyes. "Well, hello there," the man said. "I'm Mr. Whistle, the conductor of the midnight train. What are you two doing here so late?" Emily found her voice first. We wanted to see if the midnight train was real," she said. Mr. Whistle smiled. "Well, as you can see, it is very real. Would you like to come aboard?" Emily nodded excitedly, but Thomas wasn't sure. "We should go home," he said. "Our parents will worry." Mr. Whistle looked at his big pocket watch. "Don't worry," he said. "On the midnight train, time works differently. I can have you back before anyone knows you're gone." Emily pulled on Thomas's arm. "Please, Thomas," she said. "When will we ever get a chance like this again?" Thomas thought for a moment. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. "But we have to be back soon." Mr. Whistle smiled and waved them onto the train. "All aboard the midnight train," he called. Part 4. The Journey. Emily and Thomas stepped onto the train. They couldn't believe what they saw. The inside of the train was beautiful. The seats were soft and red. The walls were made of dark wood. Everything sparkled and shined. Mr. Whistle showed them to their seats. "Make yourselves comfortable," he said. "We have a wonderful journey ahead of us." The train started to move. It went faster and faster. Emily looked out the window. The town disappeared quickly. Soon, they were traveling through a strange, misty landscape. "Where are we going?" Thomas asked. Mr. Whistle smiled. "The midnight train goes to many places," he said. "Places that are hard to find in the day. Places of wonder and magic." As they traveled, Emily and Thomas saw amazing things out the window. They saw a forest where the trees were made of crystal. They saw a field of flowers that glowed like stars. They saw a city in the clouds, with buildings made of rainbow colors. Inside the train, everything was magical too. The teacups filled themselves. The lights changed colors. Music played, but there were no musicians. Emily and Thomas met other passengers on the train. There was a man who could talk to animals. There was a woman who could paint pictures that came to life. There was even a friendly ghost who told funny jokes. Time seemed to pass very quickly on the midnight train. Emily and Thomas were having so much fun. They almost forgot about going home. Part 5, The Return. After what felt like hours of wonderful adventures, Mr. Whistle came to Emily and Thomas. "It's time to go back," he said. "Your stop is coming up." Emily felt sad. She didn't want to leave the midnight train. "Can we come back?" she asked Mr. Whistle. Mr. Whistle smiled kindly. "The midnight train comes for those who need it," he said. "Who knows? Maybe one day you'll hear its whistle again." The train slowed down. Emily and Thomas looked out the window. They could see their town coming into view. The train stopped at the station. It looked just like it did when they left. Mr. Whistle opened the door for them. "Thank you for riding the midnight train," he said. "Remember, this is our little secret." Emily and Thomas nodded. They stepped off the train. As soon as their feet touched the platform, the train started to move again. In a blink of an eye, it was gone. Emily and Thomas looked at each other. Did that really happen? Then Thomas looked at his watch. It was 12:05. "We better get home," Thomas said. "Mom and Dad might wake up soon." Emily and Thomas hurried home. They snuck back into the house as quietly as they could. Everything was just as they left it. Their parents were still asleep. Part 6, The Secret. The next morning, Emily woke up early. For a moment, she thought the midnight train was just a dream. But then she saw Thomas at breakfast. He gave her a special smile. She knew it was real. At school that day, Emily wanted to tell everyone about the midnight train. But she remembered what Mr. Whistle said. It was a secret. That night, Emily looked out her window before bed. She thought she heard a faint whistle in the distance. She smiled to herself. Emily knew that somewhere out there, the midnight train was running. It was taking other people on magical adventures. And maybe, just maybe, one day she would ride it again. As Emily fell asleep, she dreamed of the midnight train. She dreamed of all the wonderful places it could go. And she knew that sometimes the most magical things in life are the ones we keep secret. The end.